Thank you for the generous introduction, and great to be with you here this afternoon. My topic is, as you probably can see, yes, it is there, a quotation from the very last line of the Old Testament from the book of Malachi. And it is obviously an ominous passage, but it is a passage intrinsically related to my theme today, which is Christian education, the necessity thereof, and its connection with the family. So the quote there from Malachi, I will return to at the end, because I think that this, all of God's words are always relevant and always applicable. But here we have a particularly serious threat. It was mentioned by Wes in the previous session that there's a 400-year hiatus between the writing or the conclusion of the Old Testament and the New, a silence as it were. And this concluding passage, striking the land with utter destruction, is obviously a word of warning, hopefully also for us. I want to begin with a very different writer, one of my favorites, as a way of introducing the topic. This is a quotation from John Calvin. In relation to the topic of education, he begins his Institutes with this line: nearly all the wisdom which we possess, that is to say, true and sound wisdom, consists of two parts, the knowledge of God and of ourselves. But while joined by many bonds, which one precedes and brings forth the other is not easy to discern. This is an important thing for Calvin to acknowledge here and for us to acknowledge here, because what he is actually saying is that there is a knowledge that the world does have, and which we need to understand, because all truth is God's truth, as is regularly said in Christian circles. But often you would think, certainly in Bible colleges and even in universities, Christian universities, you would think that the sum of everything that we need to know is situated only in Scripture. And Calvin acknowledges in the very introduction of his Institutes that that's not all that can be said on the subject. In fact, which one precedes and brings forth the other is not easy to discern, he says. All the same, when we're considering the nature of humanity and the nature of God, we're going to see that they are very much linked. And in order to understand what human nature is, we first have to know what God's nature is. So I'm going to go through a few texts here that I think you might find helpful on this subject. First one is probably an obvious one from Genesis, the creation of mankind. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So that's the first statement about mankind, obviously, because it's the creation of mankind in Genesis. And that's where the Bible begins. But that's not where we begin in our culture today. In general, in Christian circles we might, but the world, the Western world, let me talk about the Western world here, does not begin there, nor does it really think it of much interest, let alone of importance. It is, and I'm going to demonstrate why the loss of this knowledge is catastrophic. But it's going to take me a few minutes to get there. But the general view of the human being over the past couple hundred years, in terms of, I'm a literature professor, you heard that, in terms of literature, portrays their heroes as orphans. In the Bible, it speaks of the state of orphanage as one of the worst states that you can suffer as a human being. It recommends the church to take care of the widows and the orphans for that reason. The reason is because an orphan is somebody who has nobody to look after him or her, and they're usually in a state where they can't fend for themselves. If you don't have a family, you're easy prey for other individuals. An individual on his or her own is pretty much defenseless. And the possibilities of enslavement are easy, particularly if we're talking about children. Despite that, in literature from the late 18th century onwards, we will see that the heroes of fiction are invariably orphans. You'll know it best, not in romantic literature where I can cite it in Byron and Keats and Shelley and so forth, but particularly in Byron. You'll probably know it best from Charles Dickens. If you know any of the novels of Dickens, Dickens' heroes are almost invariably, in fact, as far as I know, they are always orphans. That tendency does not remain in Dickens' fiction. It continues on throughout the 19th century, becomes part of Canadian literature. Anne of Green Gables is an orphan. So it's not just men, it's women. And then it becomes a part of film. The character of James Bond is an orphan. Harry Potter is an orphan. The heroes of comic book fiction are all orphans. Superman and Spider-Man and Batman and so forth. So after a while you start to think this isn't just a coincidence, this is a type that's being put forward and it's being put forward as heroic. What is it about an orphan that would possibly be something that we should look up to and model ourselves upon? And the answer seems, I'm speculating, seems to be that an orphan doesn't know who his or her parents are, and therefore has to interpret reality for themselves. Has to make it up from experience, and has to rely on him or herself to make his way in the world. And the novel or the comic book or whatever will trace the development of the character and his actions of revealing who he is by his actions. We'll follow that. In the 19th century, they tend to be just random individuals who are admirable in some way. In the 20th century, they get something that they don't have in the 19th century, that is powers. When I talk about powers, I'm talking about supernatural powers. In the case of James Bond, he's the man that can shoot every other spy down. He's a particularly lethal individual. In the case of the comic books, they have some sort of literal superpower. They're able to fly, or be invisible, or be invulnerable in some way. There's some accident that results in this, or they're from another planet. It doesn't matter. They're various iterations on the same theme. They have superpowers. Powers that they can amplify through technology, or perhaps it's through a biological or a biochemical mistake or radiation or who knows what. But we still have an orphan. And that view of human nature that we are in control of and we need to develop for ourselves from our own perspective is presented to the culture as something that we should model ourselves after. Because that's what a hero is. A hero is a type of individual that we see as a role model. Now, why would that be the role model, and why does it appear when it appears? I'm going to come to that point now. So what is human nature? This is the first statement on it. I said the second thing we can say about human nature is that we're made in the image of God. That's clear from the Genesis text. Note that Adam and Eve are made in the image of God. They are not the image of God. They're made in the image of God, and so they're created beings. Adam's created out of the earth, but they are not gods. Whereas Jesus, here in Colossians 15, it states, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. We could carry on. I'll just stop with that there. So Jesus is the image of God. we saw in the previous one that Adam and Eve were made in the image of God, but they are not the image of God. After the fall, which I'm not going to deal with here, they don't lose the image of God. They don't forfeit. They're still made in the image of God, but the image of God has been defaced. It's not fully evident in Adam and Eve anymore. They still remain human beings. If they weren't human beings, then they couldn't be saved by God. They would become something different. But they have they've defaced the image of God. Their moral nature has fallen. They're subject to futility in their lives. They're subject to death. That was not how it was in the beginning. But they're still made in the image of God. If they want to see what a perfect human ought to be like and what they were originally made to be like, well, then they would have to look to Christ. So human nature is going to be related to God's own nature. And where will we see that presented most clearly? Well, here's declared in Colossians. But I think in terms of Scripture and in terms of the Christian faith, well, let me ask you the question. What is the first image that comes to your mind when you think of the Christian faith? What's the universal symbol of Christianity? The cross. Right. And yet, at the cross, we see something that is very difficult to understand. And from the world's perspective, doesn't make a great deal of sense. Because at the cross, what the world sees is something shameful and something weak and a life of folly and a life of condemnation. And they see somebody who is being punished for sin. And they see a dead man. That's what the world sees. They see shame and weakness and folly and condemnation and sin and death. They see those things. But it's revealed in Scripture that what is the truth of the matter is that what we see as shame, God calls glory. What we see as weakness is the exhibition of God's strength. What we see as folly is the wisdom of God. What we see as condemnation is the acquittal not of Jesus, but of humanity. What we see as sin is actually Christ's righteousness in terms of our benefit from it. And finally, in his death is our life. So there's an exact reversal here at the cross of what we, from the perspective of the world, will see as the lesson to be drawn from the cross. So I would say from the world's perspective, everything is exactly the opposite to what the gospel declares there. Now that vantage point and what happens at the cross is absolutely central to what Calvin is going to go on then describe in the Institutes as the sum and substance of Christian theology. But that vantage point is not the vantage point from which the idea of humanity as an orphan begins. It does not begin from that vantage point. It does not go to the cross to understand our nature nor God's nature. It begins with the idea of God as an absence, the deus incognito. This is the perspective that you'll know our illustrious Canadian forebear, our contemporary Jordan Peterson. He sees God as being a great idea. And he sees evidence of God's work in the universe all around us. He sees it in the family. He sees it in human history. He's benefited from our friend Vishal Mangalwadi's book, who illustrates the effect of that on human history, Western history. It's transformed Western culture. I'll leave that to Vishal to talk more about that. But he sees all of that evidence there. But in terms of God, how are we to know God? He says that we can't, because God is unknowable. And he as a mortal being cannot possibly know God, and we can't know him either. But that's because he doesn't accept that God reveals himself. He doesn't accept revelation. And furthermore, that God reveals himself particularly in the cross as the exact reversal of our expectations there. But he does not base our understanding of humanity on revelation, but rather on our own comprehension of these things. And this leads him to all sorts of problems. But let me move on to that point of the cross that I just spoke about, and to Jesus' own teaching on this subject. This is the wonder of man. What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? You have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet. There's something wonderful about humanity that the psalmist testifies to, and yet sees that there's something that, quite frankly, is rather incomprehensible as well. And it's just a marvel. The ancient world does not fully understand the place of humanity. When I say the ancient world, I'm talking about the non-biblical world now. And can't really come to terms with it. So one great Christian writer, who I am not going to put up on the screen here, Augustine, when he looks at himself, he echoes what Paul actually says in Romans about human nature, which is that he does things that he doesn't want to do, and the thing that he wants to do, he doesn't do. So he is a puzzle to himself. He can't explain it. And he throws himself on God's mercies and says that he is a question to himself. I can't understand who I am. And of course, that's obvious if he is a creature. He doesn't really know the nature of human nature. And so he asks the question, who knows who I am? And he says, you know, God. And so he throws himself to God's revelation of not just who Jesus is and not just who human nature is, but who he as an individual is. God knows. And so I'm going to have to go to God and get his understanding of who I am as a person in order to figure out my life for myself. You can't begin with the idea that God is unknowable. God has to reveal it to you. Now, if he has not revealed himself, then you're left in the position of never being able to figure out why you do contradictory things, why you get involved in addictions, why you do crazy things contrary to your character. You call them contrary to your character because you flatter yourself. You say, oh, I don't normally act like that. And maybe you don't most of the time. But every once in a while you do something that you say is contrary to your character. Well, why do you do that then? Is the thing that's contrary to your character actually part of your character, or is it different from your character? We like to minimize it when it's related to us, and we like to maximize it when it's somebody else's character aberration. All the same, how do we explain this thing? Again, we can't explain it. But God does explain it. And so he talks about this. And when he is asked what the nature of God is, then Jesus answers this. What's the greatest command in the law? And Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the great and first commandment, and a second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. All the law and the prophets depend on this. So in the answer to the greatest command, he cites this passage. Now, where's this passage from? Do you know where Jesus, he's actually quoting in the first line here. Where's he getting this from? Shema, O Israel. Hear, O Israel. The Lord your God, our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and gates. So you're to teach them. And if you do not teach them, take care that you do not forget, what will happen? He will destroy you from off the face of the earth. Jesus talks about the greatest commandment, which is to love the Lord your God, and is expecting his audience to understand that this is part of the teaching mandate of the people of God. It's in the context of the family, not just the family and the household, because you can see what it is. You teach them to your children, talk them when you sit down in your house, when you walk, when you lie down, when you rise, in other words, all the time. But where else? Well, it's a sign on your hand. Okay, you know about the phylacteries and so forth, maybe that are there on your wrists and on your forehead. Yes, but why is it on the wrist and why is it on the forehead? Well, because it governs your actions, what you do with your hands, and your thoughts. It's total. It's your thoughts, it's your actions, and also it will govern the doorposts of your house, so it governs what we call the private sphere, your home, and it will also be on your gates, in other words, the civic realm of politics, of interaction with others. In other words, the love of the Lord will pervade all of these areas. at all times. So it's total. Education will not just be something that you do in order to get a job. It will be a total life experience in every area of life. For which reason, Paul cites it again in Ephesians 6. First he talks about the children, and note that he again says that it may go well with you in the land, reference back to, again, the possibility of destruction. But then talks about fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and then the instruction of the Lord. Well, that word, discipline and instruction, in Greek is paideia and nouthesia. Paideia is the word for culture in general, or education. A child is a pais, from which we get pediatric. And paideia is everything that will be needed for a child's total education, from which we also get the word encyclopedia, by the way. This is all the knowledge that you will need to be an adult. And instruction is the nouthesia. Well, that relates to the nous, or the mind. On that point, again, Paul, Romans 12 here, says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. I'll come to that in a minute. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Okay. This is very holistic here. He's not just talking about an intellectual change. Your body and your mind and your soul and your entire being are to be re-understood. Your actions, what you do with your body, what you do with your thoughts. All of these things are to be offered to God as a living sacrifice. But also, in particular, the emphasis in verse 2 is on an intellectual transformation. You no longer can be conformed to the pattern of this world. Well, what's the pattern of the world right now? It's to look upon ourselves as orphans. Don't conform to that pattern. Understand yourself to be a part of a family. Understand yourself to be made in the image of God. Do we understand the image of God from the pattern of the orphan in the last 200 years? No, not at all. In fact, we see a total repudiation of the idea that we're related to one another, that we're related to our parents, that we're related to our forebears, that we're related to anyone for that matter. In fact, we're autonomous orphans fending for ourselves, looking for signs of greatness from those who have superpowers, maybe. We're not to be conformed to that pattern, we're to be transformed by the renewal of our minds. Well, when we are transformed, how are we going to do that? Well, in accordance with how God reveals himself. And how does he reveal himself? By the mark of love. So we first love God, and we understand God's love at the cross. That's what love is. This is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and gave his son as a propitiation for our sins. 1 John chapter 1, verse 8. And we are to do likewise, not only towards God as he's done towards us. In fact, he initiates it, but then to do so to our neighbors. Now, this will then not just be in terms of our actions, but in how we think about other people. So it's a total transformative paradigm. It's right there in Scripture. And it should mark all education that is called education. Nothing else deserves the name education that is not marked by these things. Let me move on here. I don't even know what time I have. Oh my goodness, I'm running late. This may not work out well at all. I will skip out over Irenaeus of Lyon. He's just talking about the holistic concept of human nature, not just a soul and spirit, but also a body. I want to go to the 7 liberal arts now. This is how education is historically understood in the West. It has 2 features. These are the 7 branches of the liberal arts: grammar, dialectic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. The first 3 are related to words, the latter 4 are related to number. I won't go through grammar, I assume you know what that is. Dialectic, you might want to call that logic. Rhetoric is the presentation of logic in persuasive fashion. I'll skip over that because I want to focus on the quadrivium here. These are the sciences of number. Note that I call them, both of them, sciences. There's a knowledge there that is inherent in all these things. We don't make it up. The world is God's handiwork, and the knowledge is there already in those things. It's in the world around us. Calvin, remember, he said, I don't know where to begin. Do we begin with the knowledge of God or the knowledge of man? Where does this begin? Where does this end? It's unclear. It's not clear where that line is because they're both created by God. Right? So we get knowledge from everyday experience. We don't get the knowledge of God himself. That has to be revealed to us. But we do get truth just from looking at the world around us. Well, how about in these areas? Let me break this down a little bit more specifically. So arithmetic deals with the relationships between discrete quantities. So numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, arithmetic. Okay, those are the difference between 1 and 2 is pretty clear. We give it a number to it, even though we've never seen 1 appear in nature. It's a concept. It's a mathematical thing, but it's a discrete. It's this, a 1 is not a 2. Whereas geometry is an extended, continuous quantity. That's a discrete quantity. Geometry measures it in terms of space. And it's continuous. You can draw a line. And you can draw a square, you can draw a circle, etc. We remember our geometry from school. Music talks about discrete quantity in time. Music is related to time. It's not just the note, it's the tempo. Anyone who plays music knows the importance of keeping time. It's one of the things that my son has trouble doing because he wants to rush ahead and do it quickly and show how proficient he is by doing it super fast. Same with my daughter. But the timing is everything, and actually the pauses between the notes are part of the music because music is demonstrating a discrete quantity in time. Finally, astronomy investigates, again, continuous. So note that music and arithmetic are very much alike, and geometry and astronomy very much alike. One measures the earth, the other measures the stars. Let me focus on music, because this is in a way that I think we can still understand to some degree. Music, in terms of its history, is transformed by a writer of the 5th century AD by the name of Boethius. Wrote The Consolation of Philosophy. Most people have heard of that. They have not heard of this, De Institutione Musica. He talks about 3 types of music. 1, the music of the spheres. He says that there's a music in the heavens that we cannot hear, but it is the cosmic ordering of everything. There's a music, a celestial music. In hymnody to this day, well, 18th, 19th century in particular, that talks about the music of the spheres. It's referring to this doctrine. That is the music of mundana. It's an invisible, or inaudible rather, harmony. This is a Pythagorean concept which describes, and remember I said about astronomy, what was it? Continuous quantity in time and space. There's also something connected to that, a musica humana, that's the harmony. Why do we respond to music? Why do we find it beautiful? Why do we find it ugly? Why does this sound jarring? Why does this sound harmonious or beautiful? Why is that? Because there is a correspondence between that celestial harmony and the harmony that exists within the human breast. These days people do music therapy and so forth. Everybody likes to listen to music, certain types of music, and they identify with it. By the way, I'll say this more, but then the third type is that the one that we associate with music to this day, which is playing the guitar, singing, etc. The musica instrumentalis. But all 3 of these things are held to be correspondent. 3 different types. And it explains why music has its effect on us, because we are also created to be harmonious beings by an orderly God who separates light from darkness, heaven from earth, land from water, male from female. There's a harmony there that's wedded into the cosmos, which we sense and feel whenever we listen to music. Now, if you want to break the connections between one generation and the next and create chaos in a society, what are you going to do? Change its music. Plato says that in his laws, actually. If you want to destroy a society, you change its music. So it's a sort of a throwaway line. People don't pay much attention to it. But he understands that there is an eternal order to things that he can measure in terms of musical harmony. And it can literally be measured. Anybody who knows something about music, and I'm not really one to speak on this too much, but music really does have a sense of proportion and order to it. It has octaves. There are 12 golden notes. And there's an exact proportion. If you jump up a scale, it's a proportion of 1 to 2. And it's mathematically precise. You can be off key and you can hear it. And when you're off key, it really bugs you. That person cannot sing. I wish he would shut up. Right? Yeah, that's not you because you can't hear your own terrible singing, but you can hear that person's terrible singing. Right? But it's terrible. It's not just not right. It's jarring. That's because we connect truth with beauty and goodness, and so did the ancients. Now, in the founding of the university, that was actually a postulate of God in his own nature. He is the sum and substance of beauty, truth, and goodness. If you want to see what unites the 7 liberal arts, it's theology, the queen of the sciences. He is goodness, beauty, and truth. Now, his goodness, beauty, and truth is understood in all of these subordinate disciplines, which you can understand through the words, or you can understand through numbers, and these are different types of numbered learning. And we don't even think of them as connected in any way. They see them very clearly connected, as you can see. But God, in his person, is the essence of all these things, and the university was established in the Middle Ages on this understanding. It's not there in the ancient world. Doesn't exist. There is no university. There's an academy for sure. There is understanding, but there's not an understanding that there is a unity of these. Why is that the case? Well, it's because of the nature of God himself. That he is triune. That he is 3 persons and 1 God. He is both one and many. He solves the problem that the ancient world could not solve, which is namely the question of what is ultimate reality. Is it the individual things all around? Is that a God, and that a God, and that a God, and that a God, and that a God? Or is there only one God? The Greeks were polytheists. They thought there were many gods. Many countries will agree on this. More philosophically inclined thinkers like Parmenides and Plato said, no, there's a unity to it. Whatever we call God is the essence of goodness and justice and beauty and truth and so forth. He talks about this in his dialogues. But there's no way of connecting that idea that there's a manifold nature of reality, ultimate reality, and a unifying until the doctrine of the Trinity. Because God is 3 persons and 1 God. He is each. He's equally ultimate in the Trinity. And that's the beginning of the university. Now, where do we go from there? This is an exploration of the way in which eternity is measured, the circle, and the square is the way in which finitude is measured. Leonardo sees man as both of those things. He represents finitude and also eternity. There's something about man. He's reflecting on Psalm 8. This is called Vitruvian man. After architect in the Roman period, and he in the Renaissance brings these two together. The idea that man, in his nature, is in some sense a symbol of the perfection of God. Now, people will often talk about this as humanism, but there's more than that here. It's not just a retreat to some sort of pagan worship of man. There's a sense of the eternity in mankind being represented in the Renaissance. I'll skip over this, however. Let me come to Mr. Luther, who also talks about the importance of music. Surprisingly, you never hear this about Luther. The reason he says what he says here is that we must teach it in schools, and a schoolmaster ought to have skill in music, or I would not regard him. Neither should we ordain men as preachers, unless they've been well exercised in music. Why? Because we have to hear them sing? Maybe. I think it's more because he recognizes the importance of music in the harmony of God's created order. There's a sense of order. And the preacher has a sense of that and needs to have it intuitively. It's not just he's got a good ear. No, he knows the science in it. And he can express it in a beautiful way. There's a cosmos being expressed in his understanding of music. Let me move on from that. I was going to make a lot of comment about that, but I'll skip over it. This sense of harmony I'll skip back here, in the music of the spheres is broken when Galileo with his telescope discovers that actually the earth is not at the center of the cosmos, it's the sun. But the 7 liberal arts are connected with this whole cosmology. Music is connected with it, so is math, so is astronomy. In fact, everything is connected in this medieval world picture. It's sometimes called the Elizabethan world picture. It's all interconnected. So if you change the astronomy, it has a potentially catastrophic effect on all knowledge. And that's what our man, Mr. Donne here, expresses and he calls it a new philosophy. He's not referring to Descartes here, by the way. This is 1611. I'm going to come to Descartes. But he says, a new philosophy calls all in doubt the element of fire is quite put out, the sun is lost, and the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. And freely men confess that this world's spent, when in the planets and the firmament they seek so many new. They see nova. With a telescope, they saw a nova go across the sky. That's not part of the celestial, eternal cosmos. They see that this is crumbled out again to his atomies. There's no longer a coherence. 'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone, all just supply and all relation. Prince, subject, father, son are things forgot. For every man alone thinks he hath got to be a phoenix, and that then can be none of that kind of which he is, but he. This is in the early 17th century. This is the beginning of a sense of orphanage, a sense of estrangement from the cosmos. It will take time for that to play out. It will need a philosophical expression supplied by this man, Descartes, and his method of doubt. Everyone educated knows these words, cogito ergo sum, but they don't see the 3 preceding words. I doubt, therefore I think therefore I am. The first is the most important step. He is going to base his whole methodology on the premise of doubt. And what does he do? It's a thought experiment. He doubts because he has observed several years from me declare that I had accepted even from my youth many false opinions for true. Like what? Well, the sun rises and sets. Does it not rise and set? Well, not according to the new cosmology, it doesn't, because the earth is moving around the sun, not the other way around, but it looks like the sun is moving around us. I had thought those were true. And from that time I was convinced of the necessity of undertaking once in my life to rid myself of the opinions I had adopted and of commencing anew the work of building from the foundation. So what does he do? He doubts everything that he can't be certain of. The only thing that he can be certain of is that he's doubting. And if he's doubting, he's certain that he's thinking. And if he's thinking, then he is certain that he exists. And if he exists, then he can imagine a being infinitely great who also exists, and therefore God depends on his perception of him. So now it flips it around. God is in our image. How do we know what God is like? We have to speculate. We can imagine God and he will be in our image, rather than the other way around. Jordan Peterson will begin here, like every modern social scientist. From our thinking, not from revelation, not from the nature of things, but the predicate of doubt related to a seemingly irrelevant change in a very small thing, namely astronomy. It trickles on down. It trickles on down into the methodology of the Royal Society. What's the methodology of the Royal Society? Well, what's its motto? Nullius in verba. Nobody knows Latin. Nothing in words, or trust no one's word. Test, verify, observe. the methodology of the empirical sciences. 1660, Royal Society. Nullius in verba. Trust no one's word. You're going to test it for yourself. You're going to experience it. You can't cite Scripture. You can't cite the authorities. Don't tell me what is the accepted body of knowledge. You have to build it from ground zero. You have to act as if you're an orphan. Do it for yourself. All the same, in the midst of this period, there is a counter movement against modernity. And that is presented here by one of my great heroes, John Milton, who understands education not as something progressive, not that we learn through methodology, not that we learn through process, not that we learn through experience, but rather that we learn by regaining to know God aright. And out of that knowledge to love him, to imitate him, to be like him as we may nearest by possessing our souls of true virtue, which being united to the heavenly grace of faith makes up the highest perfection. But because our understanding cannot in this body found itself but on sensible things, because we have physical bodies, nor arrive so clearly to the knowledge of God in things invisible as by the orderly conquering over the visible and inferior creature, the same method is necessary to be followed in all discrete teaching. So it will not only be based on revelation, as in the Word of God, it will be based on physical experience. But note that he's basically expressing the same thing John Calvin did at the beginning. It's going to be both of those things. But which one is normative? Note the priority. We have to know God first. Otherwise, we're not going to understand these other things. Otherwise, we may think ultimate reality is just material matter. That's what the Marxists are going to conclude. Karl Marx, who studied, for his doctoral thesis, studied the atomistic philosopher of the ancient pre-Socratic world, Democritus. He thought ultimate reality was just atoms. Discrete atoms disconnected. No connection whatsoever. It's just material. It's just one. A monad. I believe that a triangle, if it could speak, would say that a God is eminently triangular. And a circle, that the divine nature is eminently circular, and thus would everyone ascribe his own attributes to God. So we project on God what our nature is. If we were triangles, we would think that God was a triangle. If we were squares, we would think it. So in other words, God's unknowable. And we just project on him. That's Spinoza's point of view. What else does he say? He said it's not possible that we should remember that we existed before our body, or can bear no trace of such existence, neither can eternity be defined in terms of time, or have any relation to time. But notwithstanding, we feel and know we are eternal. So Spinoza thinks that he's a God. And he thinks that everything's a God. He's a pantheist. And he doesn't think that God, the eternal God, can be known in terms of time. Well, what did that the seven liberal arts declare? A relation of extension of time in the cosmos. The result of the loss of the seven liberal arts is Spinoza's pantheism. He thinks that everything is God. Not just that he is God, but that everything is God. There's a total collapse between categories here in Spinoza's thought. God is not he who is, but that which is. An even more clear demonstration of what I've just said. God is everything, and everything is God. Now, with that understanding, you're going to find that all of the distinctives that are part of knowledge, the discrete qualities, the extension of discrete qualities. Oh, by the way, I didn't even say this about Descartes. When Descartes is thinking about himself, the cogito, he is the anthropology that people talk about Descartes. Well, what sense of human nature does Descartes have? Academics tend to describe his view of human nature as a ghost in a machine. His body is an extension of the res cogitans. He in Latin, because he writes it in Latin, he talks about the body as a res extensa. So it's an extension of the thing that was thinking. Here's an extension. So it's all just thought. It's a very intellectual world. The body is just literally a machine. But it's not really us, or it's an extension of our thoughts. He loses the sense of human nature having an integrity about it, in other words, because of his method of doubt. And in the gap that comes as a result of this, Spinoza thinks that not only we are God, but everything is God. It's not just that I can think of God, I am God. Here's Einstein's comment. I am fascinated by Spinoza's pantheism, but I admire even more his contribution to modern thought because he's the first philosopher to deal with the soul and body as one and not two separate things. And that's probably, I think that's an accurate statement. He is the first to think that it's all one. And there's no distinction between them. The ancient world never would have concluded such a thing because it's crazy. But if you have the method of doubt, and you're going to doubt absolutely everything other than the fact that you're doubting, then suddenly everything becomes possible. The craziest thought. Modern science cannot distinguish between the idea of a transcendent God and us as gods. It's popular these days to say it can't even distinguish what a woman is, which is true. But it doesn't know what anything is anymore. All the categories of distinction are gone because everything's God. If everything's God, nothing's God. And so nihilism or atheism is the same thing as theism here, effectively. With that, I will add, there's also a sense that every moral category will disappear because there's no distinction between good and evil, or right and wrong. It's just a matter of perspective, but really they're effectively the same thing. They're a matter of perspective and preference, for that matter. With that in mind, let me move on. This is the panopticam, by the way. This is Jeremy Bentham's body, by the way, it's in a wax. It's sort of been embalmed, and he's sitting in University College London, and there's a camera in his hat, so it's watching you. Yeah, and you can see it online and so forth. But Bentham comes up with the idea of utilitarianism. So if there's no difference between your mind and your body, what we should aim for in the humanities is maximizing bodily pleasure. Because again, the body, mind, soul distinction effectively not there. What can we know? Well, we know what we sense, we feel. And he says that we should aim at pleasure or happiness, the only thing that truly has intrinsic value. It's an extraordinary statement, actually. But it follows from what went before him. Likewise, actions are right if they promote happiness, and wrong if they produce unhappiness. Finally, everyone's happiness counts equally. These are his three basic principles, and he creates a pain and pleasure calculus to figure that out. This is the basis of the modern social sciences. They try and maximize pleasure for the greatest number of people. And they will do so by monitoring it, by statistically measuring it in terms of number, human beings and their behavior, so that we can maximize happiness. And how will they make sure that they're doing this effectively? Well, they have to observe it. It's the scientific method. How do you observe maximizing happiness? Well, through a panopticon, which is watching everything. By the way, this is a prison made in Fidel Castro's Europe. Actually, it's not Fidel Castro, but it's in his Cuba, although he was in this prison. It's called the Presidio Modelo prison. And this is the ideal of the panopticon. This is the guard tower. The guard there can watch all the prisoners. The prisoners are all around in open cells that they can be monitored. They never know when they're being watched. But it's a way of maximizing the pleasure and minimizing the pain. It's a great model for what the ideal of the social scientists of our day is, that has lost any sense of human nature and human goodness and ultimate connectedness to the universe, etc. Einstein, who I cited earlier, reduces everything to energy. This is Hannah Arendt's comment on this. If you reduce everything to mathematics, including the visible universe, everything is reduced to mathematics, she notes that every question that we put to nature is answered in terms of mathematical patterns, and there's no model by which we can measure it, and therefore we don't even understand what we're doing. We do experiments, but we don't know the results of the experiments. We have no ways of assessing the experiments except through the pain and pleasure calculus. So we'll do the craziest things. Experimenting on people, experimenting on everything, and we really have no way of processing it because it's all process. And it's all good because it's all God. You are the universe expressing itself as a human for a little while, says Eckhart Tolle, sort of guru of the 20th century. C.S. Lewis's comment is that by removing sensibility of our pupils, that is their sense of right and wrong, and say that that's not relevant, we make them pray for propaganda. And he says, a famished nature will be avenged, and a hard heart is no infallible protection against the soft head. You need to think with discrete categories of right and wrong. He calls pantheism the doctrine of the devil, by the way. Calls it damn nonsense. Diabolical, and he says it's characteristic of Spinoza and Hegel and Marx. And we expect people to act virtuously in spite of removing the organ that would act virtuously. We remove their chests. I won't get into Lewis too much. But removing that sense of human nature, bearing the image of God, saying that that's something that we can't verify, etc., we remove the very thing that will make us human, and then ask people to act humanely. Not possible. And you do it for power. Where's the power that you're going to get from this? Well, social media is one of them. Here's the lure in 2014. Maximize engagement. What goes with it in the process? All of these things were lost in the last 8 years, 10 years. Social chaos. A predatory surveillance state. Polarization because everybody, your identity is now in terms of numbers, by the way. So online you have virtual identity. It can be identified in terms of your number. It's not your name, it's not your face, it's not your person, you have a number. The number can be tabulated online, and in accordance with your clicks, your identity will be marked out there. And you can be polarized on it because it gets more clicks. And that will create conflict, chaos, addiction. And the effect of this on the self-interpreting Cartesian orphan, you can see it there off the charts. In the last few years, in Gen Z, in particular those who have grown up with the internet and stayed on the internet, almost 20% identify as LGBT by birth year. I can tell you that the majority of them are T. They don't differentiate them, although they should. These are people who don't know their identity as male or female. Gender identity is a totally fictional postulate. There's no verifiable way of determining it. But if you think that everything is one, then what's the difference between sex and gender anyway? And what's the if we create our reality, then why wouldn't we create that as well? But note the spike. Note how it changes from 2014. How great a spike that is. This is the effect of the loss of a sense of human nature in our education system. I think I'm going to leave it with that because I'm running out of time, and this is what I wanted. I saw this the other day, and I thought, I sort of feel like this lamb in the back of a car with 10,000 pounds worth of heroin and cocaine with a bag of chips. It's like the lot of human nature in our day. It's like you're this poor little lamb. Yeah, bleeding. He's got, anyway. And then we get post-humanism. I'll stop because I've shot over my time or close to it. Comments or questions? Post-humanism. Thank you. Okay. So humanism has a sense of human nature that it is a legacy of Christianity, but not just Christianity. Even in the pagan world, at least of the Greco-Roman world, even though they had a sense that there were multiple deities, they still thought that there was only one human nature. They didn't actually adhere to what we call racism. They thought there was only one race. Yeah, there's the Greeks, there's the Romans, but they're still human beings, right? In the Christian era, they understand that there's a bigger and more important sense of humanity, that God died for all human beings, right, to save them from his wrath at their sin. The sciences in their early beginning are built on the idea of the human being as a stable concept. And we can understand the world because they, again, assume that the world is God's world and he's created it, and therefore it's their dominion mandate to understand it and think through it. Transhumanism emerges in about the 18th, 19th century. It's tried to try and perfect the human being in terms of extending human life. Look at Frankenstein as a good illustration of the beginning of transhumanism. To try and take what is human and to make it better. Bigger, faster, stronger. You can use it through steroids. You can use it through eugenics. But you're trying to perfect and make, even augment what the human being is. Posthumanism doesn't think that there is something distinctively human at all. It's just another thing like everything else. And we've privileged the human in the past and said that there's a special status that human beings have that other things don't have, and therefore we have rights. Well, now we attribute rights to animals as well and the environment, and say that actually there's no distinction there whatsoever. And in fact, we can see, well, where's the problem in the world, the environment and so forth? It's actually the things that we call human beings. How do we solve that problem? You got it. And we can upload the consciousness into cyberspace and a cybernetic consciousness. What's the difference between that and an actual physical human being? Well, there is none. So posthumanism is a new branch of philosophy in the last 20-odd years. It is a very powerful literary theory, which is now throughout the humanities. There are institutes that study this in California and in Cambridge and all over the place. You'd be shocked. Of course you have. The environmental movement is fundamentally post-humanistic. It is. Its fundamental premise is that human life is no more valuable than any other thing. Not just any other life, but any other thing. And again, it fits in with Spinoza's postulate. Right? Because say, well, if the distinction, we used to have that, but is there any reason for holding that? No. Absolutely. Not having children or trying to reduce the lifespan of those who are living. So made. Yeah, abortion and euthanasia are two sides of the same coin. And they just they meet in the middle eventually. You get the weakest, the ones that can't advocate for themselves. You could speak about their there's an economic imperative, but it's actually more profound than that. There's a view that human life is not valuable, not intrinsically valuable. Again, in Scripture, it doesn't talk about posthumanism. But if you look at the way in which the humanities and the sciences are developing, you can see it very clearly. Now, Scripture has a lot to say about it, but it doesn't mention the word posthumanism. So are you going to study it in a seminary? Never. Not yet, anyway. There's another question, comment. Nietzsche said it was power. Freud said it was sex. Marx said it was money. Take your pick. And all three of them are have very loud voices in academia. Money, sex, and power. Well, they sort of fit with the other ones. But I mean, what are drugs? No, I know what drugs are. I mean, in terms, it's what the lamb has in the back seat of that car. Yeah. I'll finish with that. Thank you.